Welcome to the Astrology and Self-Mastery Summit. I'm your host, Suzanne Gerber, and I'm so excited to be bringing you this 3-week series during which I get to interview some of my favorite astrologers and a few others about self-empowerment, free will and karma, and how they play out in our lives and our relationships. Over this past extraordinary year, these topics have dominated conversations with friends and clients alike. People are looking for more meaning and significance in their lives, and they want to understand their quote unquote life's purpose. And lucky us, we get to listen to 21 amazing astrologers talk about these very subjects. The guests on this summit come from different backgrounds and have divergent ideological approaches. And I never know exactly what they're going to say, but I can predict that you won't want to miss a single interview. Today, I'm very excited to be talking to Gemini Brett, a world-renowned astrologer, shamanic storyteller, and inspiring educator known for his passion for reconnecting astrologers with the sacred astronomy of the living sky. Brett's devotion and innovation were honored last year by the Organization for Professional Astrology, which presented him with the 2020 Orion Award for Outstanding Contribution to Astrology. If you're familiar with Brett's work, you'll know you're in for a treat today. And if you're not familiar, sit back and prepare to be entertained and have your mind open to some exciting new ways of thinking about the planets, the sacred geometry of what Brett calls the living sky, in a talk about embodied astronomy as part of his ongoing cosmic curriculum. Brett also has a special gift for everybody, which he'll tell us about at the end of the interview. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gemini Brett. Welcome to the summit.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. That feels great. How are you doing? You must be busy right now.
Yeah. Well, I think this is going to be a lot of fun, and it really is an honor to have you here. And there really are so many things that I personally want to ask you about. And, because we don't have all day, as much as I might enjoy that, you have such deep studies, both academic and experiential. And I think that it might be a really interesting place to start, Brett, if you just share with people what you even mean when you talk about embodied astronomy, and what is it? What are we talking about when we talk about the sacred geometry of the living sky?
That's a wonderful and a huge question. I'll start by sharing that I'm drinking a very old pu'er tea from the Yunnan province in China. It's from leaves that are older than I am, and from a tree that certainly is hundreds of years old, these trees. And they're really cool teachers because they've been reaching for the stars for hundreds of years, but only because they're so deeply rooted into the earth. And I've chosen a teacup. I actually did synchronistically. I have a set of what I call teacup tarots that have the planet glyphs on them. And I'll show you this one is the earth glyph, which we say is the cross of matter inside the circle of spirit. And I share this because it's a huge answer to your question. There's one planet on the chart that's more important than any of them, and it's called the Earth, right? It's the planet that you chose, or the one that chose you. I don't know how that works. And I think we miss that in our astrology so often, of having a nature-based experience of the astrological happenings. Many will say that astrology is symbolic language, and it is. But very importantly, it's also, as I like to say, the poetic breath of nature. And it's my feeling and my findings and my experience and my teachings that when we re-nature this craft, that we will remember the roots of its rules and the proofs of the equations we use. So in regards to geometry and astronomy, when we hear those words together, they are actually two of a 4-part path in the mystery traditions that's known as the quadrivium, which is the sacred sciences. And they're weird words to us now because one of them is arithmetic. And you say, oh, what? That's 3 + 5, that's spirit. But importantly, that word back then, I kind of use this term number magic to explain now, because in the tradition, it's not only quantity of number, like 1 + 1 = 2, but it's quality of number. And you can't add oneness to anything because it's everything. And so number itself is kind of at the root of tradition, and then it flowers into number in time, which is frequency, and that's harmony. So you'll find that music is like a very beautiful sister science of the cosmic craft, and the other is number in space, which is geometry. And my shirt would probably speak more towards the geometry of the ancient ways and like the Euclidean proofs that we did in high school. And then those branch into astronomy, which was known as number in space and time. And astronomy is half of the craft we now call astrology. But really, astrology is two things. It's astronomy and correspondences. So the astronomy is the quantity of the heavenly happenings. It's the things that we can put a ruler to. On December 21st, 2020, Jupiter and Saturn conjoined in the first degree of tropical Aquarius. It's a big deal. I was in Sedona, saw it in the sky with my eyeballs, received that energy. It's beautiful. And I could literally like put a ruler up here and measure how far they were from one another, and know that it's going to be 20 years before they next conjoin and all this stuff. Now, how that measurable quantity dances me or dances you, the quality, the mysteries of the heavenly happening, the mystical side, that's correspondences. And that's the name that people have just replaced with astrology, because these days we push a computer button and the chart comes up. And then we can just bring all these rules and these kinds of things to it. And it's like, yeah, those cats at NASA or whatever, they're doing the math and they're giving me everything I need to cast a chart and then heal and feel and know and grow. And that's what I'm in it for, right? But we've lost this, many have lost this sacred, experiential, embodied, sentient, sensual connection to the astrology. And the astronomers of our day, for the most part, certainly not all, but for the most part, are kind of rationalists, materialists. They're not very interested in keeping the old sacred practices of astrology or astronomy, when astronomy and astrology were one and the same thing. Wasn't long ago, right? So for me, like the higher teaching observatories are the stone circles and the pyramid sites of the ancient astronomers, more so than the ones today, which are cool and we're finding out some cool things, but it's like narrowing the gaze through this long telescope, looking at one little tiny piece of space far away and long ago, rather than just kind of laying down the grass at our back, opening our vision to all of the sky and looking at how these great wheels within wheels move, and really celebrating the marriage of heaven and earth in that way. In fact, there's like a whole very important essence of astronomy, which I call earth astronomy, that many of the modern day astronomers are kind of like ignoring, because they're very focused on this kind of long ago, far away cosmology to figure out how the whole thing began, but also maybe ignoring so that they don't have to understand why the principal claims that they stake in order to prove astrology fake are like completely misplaced. And that's like a really long story. They'll say that like the signs that we're using, they're wrong because they don't align to the constellations like they used to. There's this whole 13th sign nonsense that comes marching around every now and then. And it's just like not understanding the very real and elegant and kind of like simple astronomy of astrology. So one of my great passions is to teach that, not just to preserve like an old way or to help astrologers have a more grounded experience, in a personal experience, because instead of like learning these rules of a language and just learning to speak it, it's like going outside and seeing it. And Mars just moved into Gemini. And I could have told you that by looking at the sky, because Mars is with the Pleiades now. In our day and age, the Pleiades mark that sacred gateway between the tropical signs of Taurus and Gemini. And to see this thing happen and to give myself to the sky, to bring the offerings of my presence, even if it's cold and windy, right? Sometimes we have to really kind of gear up and deal, but the sky then starts teaching you directly. And I'm very fortunate to have begun my formal astrological study at the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School with Daniel Jamario, who I know is another guest of your summit and has been in the past, because they really put a very strong emphasis on having a direct sky experience. Because you really do, and I've seen and I've shown that door to the temple to so many people now, and they all are going to have their own experience. It's different than mine, but they start receiving their own voice in astrology and their own particular guidance. And when we have that kind of intimate experience of the quantity, of the measurable, of the real world, of the big screen of the living sky, then we can have a more intimate experience of, understanding of, and therefore expression of the qualities and this more mysterious thing.
It's so beautiful. Do you get outside almost every night? I mean, do you try to work that into your your routines?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's my yoga. I lived in Seattle for 17 years when I was first turning on as a sky guy. And so a cloud comes and just eats the heavens there for months at a time. So it can really be a drag. It's cool. Like there's some old temples in Egypt, all around the world, where they would create like one little sight hole in the ceiling, you know, where you can like work just one little piece of the sky. And sometimes Seattle does that, just like the cloud is the temple. And it gives you this one hole and one star shining through. And it's like, okay, like you're my teacher today. And sometimes that can be nice. I eventually moved to California, followed art, love, family down here. And now, like where I'm sitting, we have a really wonderful view of Mount Tamalpais across the bay. And I can see sunset every day of the year. So I'm not in a dark sky place, which I would love, like Hawaii or Arizona or the many places. But I am in a place, though, close to the urban centers and with a lot of light pollution, where I can really do a lot of work. I can see the south. I can see the midheaven. So, I wake up at weird hours because the planets pull me outside. But there's a place where I can stand and I can work with a tree and I can just look at the sky and say, oh, okay, like the moon's at this degree and the midheaven's this degree and this degree must be rising, and then go home and like cast a chart and just check in on that. So a lot of the things that I teach in learning from the sky is how to see the chart in the sky and how to see the sky in the chart, and really kind of reintegrate those two, so that if the eon blast comes or ion blast and we lose these computer buttons, like I'll still be able to cast a chart just by watching the heavens. Where is Neptune and Pluto and beings I can't see? That's a little trickier, right? So we want to keep an ephemeris around. But just having that experience is so important. And even in Seattle, I would often go to see the sky, or now like this morning I woke up to go see Mercury and Jupiter are conjoined right now, and then the fog came in and so I couldn't, but I still sat there, and I know they can see me, and to bring that offering of my presence, it just helps these beings, these teachers, kind of guide our way. So it's cool to look in the chart. It's like, oh, this thing's happening right now, like Jupiter and Saturn, or Mercury and Jupiter are conjoining in my 10th house. It seems like a good career day, or you know that's great to know. But then going out to see it just really helps you and gives you time to slow down. Can't really have a breakthrough without taking a break. you know we look without, it becomes easier to look within, and just so that's been my practice for, gosh, a long time. And it's interesting, but the sky is helping, and the stars and the heavens, they're really been helping me ground and become a human being over the last decade or so.
It's a wonderful aspirational practice. I know for myself, when I started just trying to make a point of going outside every night, if only to watch the moon and watch the phases. And well, of course, we had some pretty powerful conjunctions in the past several months, and just to try to see them with the naked eye. I mean, of course, you can't shoot them with your phone, but to see it, to feel it, to just feel that connecting energy. And this isn't necessarily what we were talking about, but this was so great what you just said right now. And I have a feeling that people are wondering, okay, I live in a city, or I live in a Seattle, or a place that just gets a lot of precipitation, a lot of light pollution. What could be something that they could do just to start a little practice, just to start getting in a habit of doing something? What would be a couple suggestions?
Working with the directions, the truth of the tropical zodiac, like so many technologies of the ancient wisdom traditions, is that it is a celebration of the energies of the cardinal directions. And that knowledge seems to have been missing for a long time, even though we call these things cardinal signs, which from the center of Earth, where we are all one, are aligned to her cardinal directions. So creating a medicine wheel, or a simple sundial, working with the shadow during the day, like knowing where the directions are in your house, and then starting to integrate where, like, if those who have been studying the craft for a while, like looking at a chart, what does that mean where they are? Like if I cast a chart and it's super cloudy out, and I see the sun is in, or let's say it's nighttime and the moon is in the ninth house, right? Well, that means I can, in the northern hemisphere, just sit south, and like the moon is right here. And I mean, it takes a while to open those things up. So it's, I mean, hard to answer this question with just a one thing, but what I would say, start working with the directions, start working with what many elders of different traditions have taught about these directions. Try to tune into the ancient peoples, the elders from the area where you live, receive their transmissions, and starting with that kind of energy of the directions can really start to open up the sky. If you've been studying for a while, like in Seattle, I would use a lot of my time that I couldn't be outside and witness the heavens because the sky was closed. I'd be in like the planetarium software. So Stellarium is this really wonderful free planetarium software. I'd love to have a chart. All my clients, like especially clients where we're at it for a while, we're kind of starting in the astrology chart. And then like further down, I'm going to open into like the planetarium and say, look, this is where the stars were. Like these are the constellations that were aligned for you. These are the stories of those star groups, and not just in the Greco-Roman tradition. That's why I like to call myself a storyteller. There's so much to be said in these old tales. So another wonderful way to connect into the stories of the living sky is to tune into these old myths. And many of them are actually, they just convey this old wisdom, this old sacred science in beautiful and kind of secret ways that we call the language of the birds. And they can just really kind of tune you in, and you start, then the sky clears and you start seeing these things, and you're able to hear that language more, because the language of the birds, it speaks to you in your tongue. So I'll give you an example, right? So even when the sky's open and people are out practicing, there's a few things we can do. Like these days, we can like wave our smartphones around with the astronomy apps, and they'll tell you the ancient names of these different stars and what constellations they belong to. And oh, that's a planet, and it's cool. But it's also nice to have an experience first. So, an analog that people have probably experienced is you're out on a hike, and an eagle flies by. Well, what does that mean? Or Anna and I were hiking like not long ago in Marin, and we saw a lynx. Like I've never seen a lynx. It was so cool with like the ear things and like these giant feet. And I was just like, whoa, right? It's like, what is that? And actually, I should say she saw the lynx and was like, hey, like, and the urge in some ways is to rush home to the 7 power animal books on my shelf and see what other people say about lynx and what is that totem and all that, right? But I should first have my experience. What was happening for us? Why did that teacher come to us in that moment? And the same is true for the stars. So I had a really wonderful experience once. I was in Bend, Oregon, where my father lived at the time. I was in his hot tub, and I'm staring at the sky, and it's a beautiful, like dark night, big stars. And there's this giant star, and I'm like, whoa, like, who are you? And I could reach for my little space machine to find out. And it's like, no, actually, who are you? And I just sat and I listened, and I heard Bob Marley's Revolution very clearly, as if it was like playing on a speaker. I actually like look around and see if my dad turned some music on or something. Interesting, my dad's birthday, not the same year, but is the same as Bob Marley's. Um, and that song has like deep meaning for me. It's been part of my living language. You know, it's something I've listened to 1,000 times. So that star, in my experience, was teaching me what what he does through this language that I know. And then sure enough, later I found out that star's, Arabic name, and looked into what Ptolemy and many of the ancients had to say. And indeed, like, that star is typically aligned in revolutions, right? But this is how that star taught me, and in my language, you know what I mean? And so now I just call that star Bob. Um, right? So I know its name, and whenever I'm teaching a class, I'm certainly going to teach its Arabic name and all that. But for me, that star's Bob, and it has a much more personal meaning there and experience. There's a star I know is like Silly Rooster, and so to have that kind of thing, to kind of create our own constellations as well as learning some of the ancient way to bring ourselves to it, right? Because, and this is the thing Daniel says, which I love. It's like, when we celebrate the mysteries celebrate us.
Mm.
And so Hermes said it this way: it's true without lying, certain and most true, that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to do the miracles of one only thing. See, and so he's saying that we're not just audience members of the celestial symphony, like we have instruments in our hands and we can join the jam. And so it's really, I think, important to not lose ourselves to astrology, but rather to bring ourselves to it. That's astrology then as a way in rather than a way out. And very importantly, like, this is a participation, it's a relationship, it's a love. It really is a love affair with this dance of this planet. It's this way that time is expressed through the motion of bodies in the heavens. So, long answer to a short question, but it's not even as long as I'd like it to be.
Well, every question was just immaterial almost. And I love that last thing you said, about the mysteries, because I feel like I love how so many people are embracing astrology now and really trying to learn it in a very sincere way, not just like a cliche sun sign way. But one of the things, that I too, like you, I feel like people are so get so caught up in learning the meaning of things. When I'm sharing charts with people, they'll go, "What does that mean?" And I'll say, "I don't know what that means. Let's explore how you're experiencing it. Let's look at the mysteries. Let's let it unfold instead of trying to, run to a book or run to some software translation that tells us what it means, because it isn't that. It's more like your Bob Marley star experience. It's got to be something that's real for you, almost akin to dream interpretation. You can learn some of the classic meanings, right? But there's also a personal language that is so important. And I love how you talked about the mysteries of it.
Totally. And it's we're in a really interesting renaissance in astrology now. One is, yeah, there is so much more interest, which is great because there's more accessibility towards a realer astrology, right? I mean, people don't have to go to an astrologer or like write in to have your chart mailed to you as it was like not long ago, right? The internet's freed a lot of opportunity for communication and transmission. I mean, it obviously has its pitfalls, no doubt about that. Um, but the renaissance that we're in right now, and it's interesting, well, I think I'll leave that out. Solve et coagula is one of the ancient Hermetic axioms, and it means break apart and put back together.
Mm.
This is really happening for Western astrology. And a lot of this is kind of our retrieval of much of the ancient Western tradition and astrological systems. because, you know, it was basically burned at the stake. And fortunately, astrology cannot die because it is the poetic breath of nature. So some of this was just maintained underground, but we really kind of lost our connection to much of like the ancient approach. I mean, the ancient approach, this is another reason why to have a sky practice. Like we've got constellations of the heavenly bowl painted in the caves of Lascaux. We've got the phases of the moon carved into animal bones from tens of thousands of years ago. Like that is the ancient astrology. And Daniel and I are both, you know, another place where we connect and just instantly is we're like lovers of the stone circles and, you know, the ways that the ancient kind of celebrators of the marriage of heaven and earth like left this code in for us. But the Hellenistic era was a really interesting time. This is like the birthplace of Western astrology because there was so much, it was just a true melting pot, right? And in Alexandria, Egypt, of course, named after this conqueror, Alexander, right? One of the rules I'm told is like if you came in, your scriptures, whatever you were carrying that had words on it, would be confiscated, brought to the library, and you would be given a copy. And so they were like assimilating all of this information, including astrological information from all around, you know, the known world. And so the Persian and the Arabic and the, you know, Indian and, you know, the Egyptian, which was never really, from what I feel, meant to be exoteric. It was for the initiate. There were, you know, the Druids were this way too. The information was conveyed orally to protect it from being stolen, as can very easily happen if it's written down. So as we're translating some of these ancient Alexandria text from a couple of thousand years ago, you get there's a lot of question marks. There's a lot of like, oh, Hermes said, and it's like we think, you know, it feels like that. And there, many of the authors are actually writing like clearly that this is not something that you will understand from my words alone. Like you have to go in and meditate and have a mystical experience, or this information is never going to flower within you, right? So it wasn't just like this is Aries Venus means this, that, you know, that thing, that's we're really kind of losing this like ancient connection. So interestingly, it's very much kind of a contradiction, some of what's happening right now. There's a deep kind of schism in astrology because it wasn't long ago where it was kind of thought that Western astrology is like archetypal, psychological, like dream based, and that if you want like a predictive reading, you go to India and the Vedic astrologers, like that's what they do. But as we're now just really starting to translate texts that never completely went away, but dusting the pages off, and sadly, because much of the source material was literally burned, we're going like through the Arabic to get to the Persian, to get to the Latin, to get to the Greek. So there's some telephone game stuff going on already in the many translations, right? But we find out, oh, wait a second, like ancient astrology, amazingly predictive. Like just like a code, you know, and it's crazy, like fatalistic. And like that's in the Western tradition too. It's like, okay. So now there's a schism where it's like, oh, you're either like a modern astrologer and you're focused on like healing and feeling, or you're like a classical astrologer and you're focused on like prediction, timing, and, you know, but the Renaissance will be coagula, right? So bringing those two back together. So there's an amazing gift that's been offered by the advance in modern times because Western astrology was severed from its roots. We had to dream in a new way. I mean, if you ask the ancient astrologers what Scorpio is, you don't get any of that like, oh, like passionate, sexual, alive, leaving no stone, and like the things that we say, you know, like you get like, oh, it's the nocturnal sign of Mars. It's cold and wet. It's associated with the southwest wind. You know, it's like that kind of trip. So there's something that's been revitalized, reimagined, expanded in astrology simply by being disconnected from the roots. But then it's also, you know, going maybe far from the tree, where they're like the star seed astrology and or whatever. I mean, people do astrology the way they do that's great, you know. But so reintegrating now the roots, the rules, and I think the earth practice is a very important part of that. we'll find this renaissance, we'll find this ability to be old and be new. And so the one of the strangest things to me, and this is the reason why I bring this up in response to what you just shared, is that you'll find many of the kind of neoclassical astrologers really against the idea of using your intuition. I did a retreat with a dear friend who's very classical astrology based, and my first slide of my first teaching at the retreat was heart before chart, which is a prayer that I have before I engage with students and with clients. And his first slide was only do the chart, and he meant like don't bring your psychological thing to it, like it's right. And so it's so funny because we were coming from these very different places, and we love each other, and we've taught at each other's schools. And but anyway, so you'll see this thing a lot in like the classical astrology forums. It's like, oh, you might as well be reading tea leaves, right? If you're going to be like intuitive or psychic. Now, first of all, like reading tea leaves itself is a high art, right? But more importantly, the ancients certainly wrote not only that you have to have a mystical intuitive awareness to even understand the code of what we're teaching you, right? But they certainly wrote about the importance of what we would call intuition in a session. So, when the client says, oh, but what does that mean? Right? Part of it says, okay, great. They're asking me to stop speaking so cryptically. And maybe like I'm using too much of the astrological jargon, because saying something like, oh, well, Saturn's now squaring your natal Venus. And, like, so what does that mean? But it also, just like you said, it's like, well, you tell me, like what's happening for you. And then astrology offers this wonderful gift because in many regards it is a story of time as expressed through the periodicity of the dance of these great planets. It's like, oh, well, what was happening in 2008, because something similar then is also happening now. And let's rewind the clock a little more and tell me about 96, and you start getting the story, right? But it's instead of people who I mean, I had a client recently, I almost just gave her money back right when we started because I read the intentions that she wrote in my like, intake form. And so I like to sit with somebody and I open and it's like, oh, let's read what you wrote here. And ooh, because she's like, don't tell me about my career. She's like, I have friends that can do that for me. People always want to say this, don't do this, don't do this. And then she's like, but what I really want to understand about is like, what should my career be? It's like, what? But there was like this whole thing where she like attacked me even before it happened. And I'm talking to her, I was like, I'm just like really uncomfortable. I don't know like how to do this. And she's like, look, you're supposed to be the oracle. I was like, no, right? Like, if anything, if this is going to work, you and I are bringing offerings together to the oracle. And it's not meant to speak through me any more than it's meant to speak through you,
Oh, that's great.
right?
Yeah.
And I mean, we ended up having, I think, a pretty good session. I'm not sure what you would say, but it was one of the weirdest starts to begin. Yeah, but that expectation of somebody to just tell you who I am, tell me what I'm supposed to do, tell me what sign is the right husband for me, right? That's kind of the sun sign thing that's really kind of twisted the craft some. Um, but also to hold that honor and to understand that people that come and sit with us, like it's a big deal. It's a huge statement of trust and willingness and openness. So to find that kind of middle way where I can be, a channel and also like a well-studied and experienced and somebody who's tested these things and not just saying a bunch of stuff because I think it should work, right? And have some authority there, but also be a companion for somebody and honor that like their heart probably has more to say in the moment than their chart does if I'm willing to listen. And that's not always easy, right? Because when I say, how you doing? What do you want to look at today? Well, the time that my 5-year-old boy was diagnosed with cancer before he died a few months later. It's like, right? Because right then it's like, great, let me pull out all these charts and then I can just do my mind and show you why it happens to avoid the turbulent tidal waves of the heart at full speed, right? Or like, no, that's the invitation to drop in, right? And the right response isn't, oh, well, Uranus was. The right response is, are you okay?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know, and that's not reading tea leaves, right? That's being a human being. So, and the human beings have feet and legs and hearts and bodies, and and the body of our planet is not in the computer screen or a printed out chart. It's out there. And when we go out there, we start learning from the sky how the sky works. And sometimes that's going to encourage us to shift our cosmology altogether. Right. So
Yeah.
35 minutes in, maybe we should get to the topic at hand.
Yeah. And, I just wanted to add one thing to that. So many times when I haven't worked with someone before, I like to do a first time reading just to really understand how are the planets working for them. And they'll say, I know my chart. I've had it read, by 5 different astrologers. I just want to know my transits. And I say, well, you might know your chart, but I don't know it. I don't know how the planets work for you. And I can't really work with transits if I don't know how this is functioning, how you're feeling it, how you experience this just in your natal chart. And when we back it up like that, and I always say to them, and we'll go fast, don't worry, we'll get to your transits because that's what they want to hear. And we start to have this little exploration together. It's always so revelatory for both of us because we're just learning, like you were saying, we're learning this together. We're bringing our own, gifts to the oracle and letting this thing open up because our energies together. It's not like any astrologer is better than another astrologer. It's just what happens when two people get together and start to go on that journey together. And it's just so exciting. Just a good reminder for people, right?
For sure. And some astrologers are better than other astrologers. Right? Which we get a lot of evidence for when, I sit with somebody. It's like, oh, yeah, I've been really resistant to astrology because it was a birthday present for my mom when I was 14. And I sat with the master who told me I would never know love. And so I'm just kind of trying to deal with that. It's like, that's not a nice thing to say to somebody. And is that true, or is that just really terrible astrology? Anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
so I think part of being a good astrologer also is not only learning the thing, but being flexible in how we allow it to speak through us, and allowing ourselves also to be kind of re-educated through our experience, and not like holding on to something just because that's what the rules say, if that's not what's happening, you know and I mean, this is true in all things, right? So like, I really appreciate some of the teachings of like, not only of the plants who brought me to the planets, but also of like plant people. So like a dear friend of mine who's a herbalist, like the real deal. She taught me about plant sits, which is part of their practice, which is just kind of, if you're studying St. John's wort, for example, right? The book says what it does. But also, if you want to have a connection with that plant, then you go sit in the field when it blooms and soften your gaze and allow that fella to start, tickling your eyelids and showing you some things. And you might find that that medicine is going to work through you in a different way than the book said it should. And that doesn't mean you're wrong. And when you apply what you were taught, even if it goes against, what you're supposed to do with it, you might just find that it works. And so that was helpful for me because I realized, oh yeah, this thing that I've been doing is like planet sits. Like I just go out there and like, sometimes I'll fall asleep staring at a planet and just have a dream or an experience, or speak with the planet. And then suddenly it sends a human being representative to, speak English language to me, or sometimes even have had planets speak English. which I have to deal with. Is this like a psychotic break, or is this happening? And I usually just choose the latter because it feels safer. Um, but when you get out to the sky, things just start changing, and like the rules get rewritten. Like I've recently been taught by the moon that I should never really speak of her only without choosing to speak of the sun, because just like Diana delivered Apollo's birth, the moon's job is to deliver sunlight to Earth. And that there's so much of the incarnation written in that story. It speaks of soul and spirit and matter. And that completely kind of realigned my own cosmology as like as a human being, and certainly the way that I practice astrology. Um, and it actually kind of aligns in some regards with what I was first taught in Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, which looks at the soul path kind of from the moon into the rising sign. And I was practicing in that way for some time. I didn't really mean to practice as soon as I started to. I was just doing trades for massage and acupunctures and stuff. Literally with like Daniel's book at my side, like certainly not pretending to be some authority, you know. And suddenly they were like, "Hey, what do you charge? Because I have a couple of friends that want to come see you." I don't know, right? And so that's just like it just opened up really quick. My business back then was called More Than Astrology, which is a vision I had received in some ceremony some time before, and you know I realized that like really astrology, again, it's the poetic breath of nature. So whether you just began studying or not, you've been studying since you were born and probably before. Anyway, when I first got to an astrology conference, which was a cool blessing, because you know it can be really isolating studying these esoteric mysteries. Obviously, it's kind of tricky usually for the mystic with their own family or whatever, and you know it's hard to find community once you start going through the awarening process and all that. So it was a gift to like hear people speaking the astrology as I was walking by them in the hall, you know. But I realized people were really speaking a very different kind of astrology, and it's like whoa. And fortunately, I had utilized this kind of shamanic astrology approach enough times before then that it wasn't a question of like, well, why was I taught something wrong? It was, oh, why is this thing that I was taught also right? And you know, it also wasn't, oh, these people must be wrong because this works, because that's ridiculous. And all we have to do is lay on our back and open our gaze to the sky and see how infinite it all is to understand that you can never master this thing. When you start learning the many different approaches and paradigms, you actually find out that if you master one, you're moving really far away from the truth of another. So this is a gift I often offer to my students all the time. It's like, give up that idea that you have to master this before you can practice. It's ridiculous. You can't. Like that's literally a joke, right? So anyway, working with this idea that the rising sign is what we're moving towards. That's like I was first introduced to that in Shamanic Astrology Mystery School. And Daniel himself, you know, I mean, he could tell you better than I can, but my understanding is that that kind of came to him from more of a kind of theosophical approach to astrology. And I've just always seen that it really works. And getting out to the sky, it's like, oh, of course, you know, the sunrise is what's new. Like that's the energy, or what moonrise too, like the eastern sky. It is the rise. It is new beginnings, you know. An amazing thing, which is true, at least according to our modern physics, is that the eastern sky rises because Earth is falling in that direction. You see, and this for me is a very living metaphor of we descend into matter to lift the heavens up. So there's a couple of things that I like to say about the ascendant or the rising sign is that what's rising when you rose is rising within you. In Daniel's language, like I'm Gemini rising, so I'm a student of the Gemini Mystery School, which is a you know a fabulous invitation to study. These days, folks are really linked into their sun signs, you know, and the sun is really important in the chart. I mean, it's the only symbol in the chart that will show you what season you were born in, what time of day, right? I mean, I can look at the sun in Scorpio in the fifth, sixth house in my own nativity, and I can tell you something about what Boston, Massachusetts, when I was born, is like in you know that autumn time and at that time of day. I couldn't do that with the Gemini moon unless you told me what phase she's in, and that will help me know where the sun is, right? Like the sun is a very important being. And people are like upset with me sometimes that I've chosen this moniker of Gemini Brett because I'm a Scorpio, people will say. What do you mean I'm a Scorpio? Well, you're a Scorpio because they're talking about my sun sign. Because we've been really programmed to believe. I mean, just as we were saying earlier, it's like nice. There's this revolution now in Renaissance now, and more attention to astrology now. And one of those reasons is I can go type my stuff in on the computer and get a birth chart. Well, back then, all you could really get is what's your birthday? Oh, then you're a Scorpio, and you're on the cusp and all that stuff, right? So it's totally understandable. Also, the heliocentric, revolution that helped us understand the sun is at the center of our solar system again became very sun-centric in many ways. And we're also in a time of like one of the principal religions in the planet is very much a story of solar worship and da da da, right? But when you look back in the day, first of all, I'm born at night. So moon is my sect light, and this is a term that was like lost for a long time. Like we didn't even understand that there were different rules in this craft for people who were born during the day than there are for people who were born during the night, which totally makes sense. If I'm ever sitting with a rationalist and they're like, hey, astrology, that's ridiculous. I thought you were smart. I'm like, look, I will argue with you that astronomical cycles influence our energetic experience as earthlings. Right? And the first proof is day and night. Earth spins and the flowers open to receive the light and close at night to dream and rest. And if anybody argues that they feel different at 3 a.m. than 3 p.m., then I'm not willing to have a conversation with them. But I can start there, and then we can get to the phase of the moon and go on and on and on, right? What's rising in the east is a very important thing. And traditionally, it's called the horoscope. So we were raised believing horoscope is this newspaper column, and it's about sun signs, which in sun sign astrology is a wonderful gateway drug and it can work. But what it does is it assumes you were born at sunrise. And then it defines, in India, they call this the Surya Lagna. They define the houses from the sign of the sun. They do that much less in India than they do the Chandra Lagna, which is defining the houses from the moon. So if you know your moon sign, mine's Gemini, I might want to read that horoscope too. But horoscope, actually, Greek horoskopos means the hour marker or the hour watcher. And it specifically speaks of the ascendant, right? So this was a cool thing for me to find out, having like been on this kind of different path of the shamanic astrology mystery school, where I found out the rising sign is like where you're going. Well, they say it's the hour marker. And there's this other word for it, which is called the oiox or the iakos, which means the rudder. And truth is, astronomically, and I learned this from the sky, and you can see it during the course of the year. If you watch sunsets, they move on the horizons because they're visiting signs that have their houses on their horizons. This is all in the old language. So the ascendant descendant axis every day rudders back and forth against the cardinal directions. So I'm born with Gemini rising, which rises no matter where you are on Earth, very far north of the direction east. So this is a very specific direction. I work with that with maps with people. It would point, like mine points right to the Great Pyramid. And I've been a pyramidiot a lot longer than I've been an astrologer. So basically, we're hearing that, look, in the old language, Gemini is the rudder of my boat, of my soul's boat. What changed for me when I went into classical astrology is that I started honoring what's called dispositorship. Because in shamanic astrology mystery school, and I totally honor this, and this was true for Daniel's principal mentor as well, who was Dane Rajar. He didn't like this idea of rulership. It feels like patriarchal nonsense. I mean, you just hear it in that word, right? And why the heck would, Saturn dislike Cancer and like Capricorn? He's in both of those signs for about equal amounts of time and that kind of thing, right? Um, but in the tradition, in the kind of classical system, which is like much more mathematical, I should say, um, it's very important not only what's rising when you rose, like what the rudder is, but also who the steersman of the chart is. So being Gemini rising, I have Mercury as that steersman. And so where Mercury in the chart becomes of like even higher interest than would in other charts. And that's really kind of, that's where I start with charts these days. No matter if somebody's asking me, should they make this investment? When should they have surgery? Should they leave this guy finally? Should they quit their job and do what they love? Or what are they supposed to love? Or, I always start with the ascendant, whether I'm speaking this exoterically to them or not, because for me, it speaks to what that soul, what that individual, beautiful reflection, unique reflection of source light embodied here on earth to grow. And there's other places, like if they're asking about relationship, I'm going to focus on the seventh and its associated planet, or career on the 10th. But with all of those considerations, any question will always lead me to the whole chart, but starting in a different place. But the ascendant is the place where I personally, as an astrologer, always start. And so there's this question that's asked as people are starting to learn their charts more. Oh, if I'm listening to astrologers talk horoscopes and the 12 different signs and how this is how that Jupiter Saturn conjunction is going to work for, Taurus or for Gemini or for Cancer or whatever, should I do my sun sign or my rising sign? Both is always a great answer for somebody with such a Gemini devotion as myself. But the truth is, it's the ascendant that establishes the heavenly houses. And again, what a sun sign thing is doing is just saying that the sun is your ascendant. But if you know what your ascendant is, do that, right? Because that is your rudder. That is the horoscopos. That is the hour marker. And then there's this intriguing question of, okay, well, if that's my rudder, where is the steersman? So for me, I have Mercury in the fifth in Libra, and he's conjoined Pluto. And that's generally going to say, okay, I'm on like a Gemini quest of young and play and fun and wonder and learning and communicating and trickster mystery stuff. And that the steersman in this is in this place of passion and romance and creativity and creations, and I do try to be very like kind of artistic in my expression and creative in my expression. When I teach, there's like a lot of slides and animations and things that I bring to the mix. And I appreciate teaching, sacred geometry and art and poetry, in the expression of the astrological witness and all that. But then Pluto is in the mix too, which of course the Hellenistic astrologers wouldn't have honored since he wasn't discovered till 1930. But that is also going to say, like, probably it's going to be a bit of the dark side of some of these passionate things. And the dark night of the soul is likely going to be waiting for me there. And then that's going to be a huge part of like this course, which is one of the things which I've seen in my own life. And we tend to learn our astrology through our chart, where it's like, oh, yeah, that really works. And that really works for me. And I can honor other approaches, like my North Node is in Scorpio. So evolutionary astrology is focused there. And that's going to bring them to Pluto anyway, right? So the cool thing is you study many different paradigms and they tend to say the same story, which is so cool. Just like we can describe a scene in French and English and German, and we're still describing that scene. So I want to honor that we're at time, but I was also wondering if you might want to allow me to ask a few questions about your chart to just show another example of how I do this thing.
Absolutely, but may I just, I want you to complete a thought that you might not realize that you kind of put out there. I certainly don't have resolution to it. You said you don't like the concept of rulership because of whatever patriarchal, but you like dispositor. And I
Oh,
I feel like, to me they're interchangeable, but I feel like to you there's a connotative difference. Will you just explain that?
I tend to avoid the word rulership, although not necessarily when I'm teaching, and that's what people are going to hear anyway. But no, I've learned to kind of embrace these words like rulership, dispositor, oh, debilitated, all these things where it's like, in the modern kind of healer consciousness, I'd prefer to avoid, but I see that they speak. And so whether I'm going to use those words with a client or not is a very different story. But I think what I meant to say more than anything is I was trained in a school that doesn't really go there, and now I do. And I like, back in the day, rather than this planet rules this sign, first of all, the signs were called houses. There's been a lot of shift, right? So, and the planet has a home in that sign. So Gemini was rising when I was born. That's Mercury's home, right? And so he's going to dictate who I am because the first is me. The first house is me, and that starts with the first sign. Um, so yeah, that's a good question because I, on one hand, said like, and honestly, I don't love that word rulership. I like this word steersman. I like this word guide. Um, Teacher. I'll use all those kinds of words with the planets in relations to the signs. But I have very much kind of, right now, my current place in astrology, and we'll see where this goes. I am very much doing this dispositor thing. And that if Mars is in the sign of Cancer, well, he's kind of living in the house of the moon. So where is she and what's their story about, and go on and on. Yeah.
So it's really semantics, and people just shouldn't think that, you know, that you're getting rid of the concept. It's just the way you're choosing to call it.
Yeah, for sure. But I am coming from a school that did like has released itself from that concept. Um, and yeah, I kind of go both ways. But classically, that's just a huge one. One of the most significant differences between classical and modern astrology, for the most part, is like in modern astrology, you'll look at like Venus as relationships. And there's some of that in the old way, but actually for me, Venus is going to be about the 12th house of mysteries and about the fifth house of passions. And that's because my fifth is Libra and my 12th is Taurus, and those are Venus's realms. So if I want to look into relationships, the question is actually more governed by Jupiter because the Gemini rising chart has Sagittarius for the seventh sign, and that's Jupiter's house. That's a significant difference between, classical and modern astrology. I do them both. And sometimes you'll find one's like way more, sometimes I will find one is way more relevant for a specific client or a specific topic for a client. And the other, I really like to be flexible in my astrology. I use many house systems and it goes on and on and on. Um,
And that's why you're Gemini, Brett, not Scorpio, Brett, because you can, you like that mutability, that flexibility, that open-mindedness.
right. And so the tradition would say that I'm actually Gemini because that's my first sign. And that doesn't say that the sun is insignificant or anything like that, not in any way, right? So what's your first sign?
I am Taurus rising, late degrees, if that's part of the question.
Late degrees of Taurus. Yeah. What degree is your ascendant?
28 Taurus 50.
The Pleiades.
Is it?
Oh yeah. Yeah, the Pleiades in our day and age, they mark the gateway between tropical Taurus and tropical Gemini. So we know, like I know just from watching the sky recently, that Mars just crossed your ascendant, which is an amazing thing. It does that every couple years, but that's always a nice invigoration and awakening and all that. Yeah, so a question is, well, does it matter if I'm 1 degree Taurus or the last degree of Taurus? Classically, the primary whole sign, like by far and away, or primary house system is called the whole sign houses, where on one level, it kind of doesn't. It's like if you're Taurus rising, you're Taurus rising. And Taurus is your first sign, and Gemini is your second sign, and Cancer is your third sign, and it's like that. And one kind of interesting thing about that approach is, well, they would say in your case, like 28 degrees of Taurus were above the horizon, 28 degrees of your first sign are above the horizon, and a couple degrees are below the horizon. So for me, I'm like 10 Gemini rising, so there's so much above and so much below. And the ancient approach, Hermes, Mercury, is said to rejoice in the first. This is kind of lost to modern astrology. They associate Mercury typically with the third and the sixth signs, but traditionally the third is the joy of the moon, the sixth is the joy of Mars, and Mercury rejoices in the first house. And part of the reason why is because part of the first is above the ground and part of it's below the ground, and Mercury does everything in both ways. Um, so on one level, I absolutely work with degrees. Where is the Pleiades? And I tend to cast charts with quadrant house system, a porphyry house system, but I also do a lot of whole sign houses because I'm running this kind of classical thing in the background always. So which sign holds Venus when you were born?
Which sign did you ask?
Yeah,
It's in the sign of Sagittarius.
got it. Right. So the general trip here is that you are Taurus rising. The life's quest is about exploring the sensual, the embodied, smelling the flowers, really learning to get out of the rat race and tune into the grace of Earth's pace. Slow down, like learn to watch a sunset as if it was, the goddess painting a mimosa just for you, like it's tasting every morsel in that. And then yet Venus in the sign of Sagittarius, which is the eighth sign from Taurus. Now she's probably in your seventh house, right?
It's just,
And
I work with Placidus. And so in my house system, it is disposited in the seventh, but I know in shamanic astrology, mystery school approach, it's eighth house.
right, and classically too. And so when I'm sitting, like if I sit with a lot of like astrologer clients, right? So if you and I were talking, like I don't not bring the chart out, like we're in it, and I'll call your Venus seventh sign, eighth house.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'll call her seventh house, eighth sign. So one thing I think is very cool about the whole sign houses is they basically take the ground out from beneath your feet, right? Because that's what the ascendant descendant is. And I think they actually speak for something of us that doesn't quite have our feet on the ground, that it's a little bit closer to the template of higher self, if you will. Now, I'm usually speaking to people about rather earthly matters. That doesn't mean they don't all have spiritual context, right? And I like to work with both of these things. So, but in this perspective, I'll say that the spirit's really tuned to exploring Taurus, but through the eighth house path, which is death and rebirth, transformation, the occult, and that traditionally the eighth is said to be blind to the first in conjunct. This is true of the 12th and the 8th and the 6th and the first houses. So the Lord of the Ascendant or the Lady of the Ascendant in the 8th place says that in a sense she's steering blind, which doesn't mean bad, right? That's the issue with the modern approach to classical astrology. It's very easy to fall for this is good and this is bad.
Mm.
It basically says that for me, you're going to be encouraged through your own transformational experiences, likely stimulated through some kind of death and rebirth feels, to develop more of a psychic awareness and more of an understanding that, yes, it's about the earth, it's about the senses, it's about the body. Like I'm learning that, I'm learning to like slow down and be there and find a more kind of simple Parisian tasty experience and expression of life. But I'm not going to do that simply by understanding that the senses are the only way to experience the world. In fact, I'm going to have to develop more of kind of a psychic philosophical vent that's going to help me come down to earth. So, it's interesting because I said this about myself earlier, and some would see this as Taurus South Node in the 12th house, but it's like this philosophical, spiritual exploration called astrology is bringing me into my body. It's bringing me down to earth. And that's one thing I would feel about an eighth house Sagittarius Venus guiding a Taurus journey. And now that she's in the eighth sign, now that she's in the seventh house, like in Placidus, Porphyry, and many other house systems, it's probably going to get awakened through relationship experiences. And
It's
so it's
easy.
probably going to be awakened through relationship experience, seventh house, so that's the gateway into the death and rebirth
Yeah.
on a spiritual level. When things die, we're forced to ask why, and that's going to bring you into the mysteries, but they're not here to take you out. They're here to bring you back down.
Yeah,
So,
and I think also the fact, and this is secondary to what you're saying, but the fact that my Venus is conjunct my Saturn, I think just really underscores the point you made.
right. And I would never really do this without asking, oh, where's Jupiter? And, you need the whole chart, as you well know, and many people listening, like it's kind of foolish to just take a piece of a chart and delineate it. But I'll say, like all my students, they're one of the kind of openings when we start exploring this is, oh, well, just tell me about, regardless of what sign's rising, what is it to have the steersman in the first or the second or the third or the fourth or fifth? Look at those 12, and then there becomes the 144 potentials, and that's a number that's very familiar to me from the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School. They just come after it in a kind of a different way. So that like trained me in a sense to hear this language like beyond the 12ness, and then of course when we get into the whole chart, the thing is just infinite. But anyway, Suzanne, thank you for letting me play with just those few planets and points in your chart to get into an example here.
Well, and thank you. Like I said, it'd be very easy to just have this conversation go on, but Saturn and time and boundaries and structure. And I think we maybe just for now we'll just wrap it up. But before we let you go, you mentioned, or I mentioned the gift, but you mentioned something, you kind of alluded to the Temple of the Night Sky, and which is so perfect because that's the name, at least the working title, of the meditation that you're offering people. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of born out of this year. Instead of being able to take people out into the sky, which is something that I just love doing, I've been having to teach like solely online and stuff. And that's great for the presentations and the teaching, the roots and the rules of the thing. And even when I teach astronomy, there's a lot of animations and illustrations that I utilize because I want to help people tune into like the visual experience of this thing. But I've really been missing that like sky piece where I would travel around to sacred sites and bring folks, and we'd really connect in and be with the sky together. And so one thing that I've been creating are these like what I call scavenger hunts of like, hey, this is a thing to go out to the sky and like look for and sit with and receive. And then I'm also starting to create these kind of like audio guides to the heavenly happenings that are very like time dependent, because it's like, oh, this is happening now. But so the first one of these things, the Temple of the Living Sky, it's like an invitation to go receive the heavens, not in some way of like academically intellectual, but really getting out and having an embodied experience of it. So it's basically a guided meditation, a bit of a drum journey, and then some music that just wants to present a way to enter through the essence of awe, which is the password to the heavenly happenings, introduction for a person to their own personal doorway into the temple of the night sky.
Oh, I was just right in there with you. I just love that imagery. That was fantastic. So
Thank you.
thank you for well, everything, for for your talk, for your sharing, for the gift. It's really been an honor, and thank you so much. And I hope you'll do it again sometime. I hope we get a chance.
Sure, it's my treat. It was really nice to connect with you. And for everybody out there listening, it's nice to have an opportunity to spend some time with you. And thanks for tuning in. Thanks for bringing me here, Suzanne. Thank you so much. It's been a treat.
Yeah. And I thank everybody like you did, and just remind you there are more interviews as part of the summit. So be sure to tune into all of them. And hopefully they will all be as inspiring and enlightening as this one. So thank you, Gemini Brett. Thank you for people tuning in, and bye for now.
See you in space.